crucially to save lessons and learning for our young people. I don't know about you, but from where I'm sitting, it's felt that this third wave in many ways has been the hardest of all. Like many countries, we've seen the peak of infection get higher and higher and higher. And we have lost more and more of our loved ones and more of the people that we came into public life to serve. There is, however, light at the end of the tunnel. With the vaccine's arrival, there is now hope of an exit from the crisis that we're in. The key is now to get to the end of the tunnel as fast as possible. But we have got to get everybody there, not just the luckiest few. Pandemics do not stop at passport control, and we cannot all be safe until everybody is safe. That means we have to mobilize a global community to make sure that there isn't any community on this planet that does not enjoy access to the vaccines that science has now made available. Vaccine nationalism is a real threat to that huge task. And it's something that we in the Parliamentary Network for the World Bank and the IMF are absolutely focused on ensuring does not get in the way of this global public health emergency and our solutions. So the World Bank has been really important in helping ensure that there is the resources available. And we're going to hear from Mohammed Ali Patteh, the Global Director of Health, Nutrition and Population in a moment. And then I'm absolutely delighted that we'll then be able to turn to Thomas Telmer from the International Finance Corporation to round out the picture. We're then going to do one of our tours of the planet very quickly. We're going to hear from 5 or 6 parliamentarians from around the world. And I'm absolutely delighted that our Vice Chair, Ricardo, will be making an announcement about a particular initiative that we want to share with you today, and with which we would like to have your assistance. As ever, we're up against the clock. We've got a lot to fit in the next 90 minutes. So I'm going to ask our first 2 speakers to just try and constrain their remarks to about 15 minutes between them, if that's okay. And if I can then ask my fellow panelists to just give us the top 5 minutes of their contributions. And then that will help make sure that we've got time for some questions from you from all over the world, which we'll do our best to answer. As ever, we're keen to share your point of view, your perspectives, your insights on the digital platform that we've created for the Parliamentary Network, which is parliamentarians.org. If we can't answer all the questions today, we'll do our absolute best to make sure that we do get answers. This is one of the first sets of discussions that we've had in 2021, but there will be a number of occasions over the course of this year to get together to talk about some of the ideas that we hear about today and to review progress. So we will be trying to organise some meetings around the spring meetings for the IMF and the World Bank. We will also try and pull something together around the G7, which will be hosted in the UK in June. We then obviously have our October meetings, and then we may try and do something around COP26 a bit later on in the year, in around December. If you've got questions, it would be fantastic if you could put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat, because that just makes it a little bit easier for us to keep a handle on them. But without further ado, Mohammed Ali Patteh, I wonder if I could now hand the floor over to you to get our conversation this morning started, with a huge thank you on behalf of all of us for the extraordinary work that you're helping lead there at the World Bank. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Liam, and thank you to the board of the Parliamentary Network and to all of you for the continued engagement, for the support and partnership with the bank's group and the IMF on this pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we have seen unfold, exacerbated inequities all over the world, between countries and within countries, across income, gender, race, and other socio-demographic characteristics of populations. It is threatening our goal to end extreme poverty. 150 million people are estimated to be pushed into extreme poverty by the end of 2021. And where we are today, vaccines offer at least one tool, one critical tool to mitigate this unfolding disaster on our world. The World Bank, as I think we've discussed in the past, started out with a very fast and broad response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Since mid-March, the fast-track facility that was approved by the board made available initially $14 billion US, 6 billion of which was to IDA and IBRD countries, and 8 billion was through IFC to enable the emergency response. And in April, the first sets of countries had resources at hand to get the necessary equipment, PPE, strengthen their health system, engage their communities. Now, by June, the much broader socio-economic package was announced, within which this health response to countries, as well as through the IFC, was located. We undertook all of these efforts in a globally coordinated manner with WHO, with UNICEF, with Gavi, with others in the landscape. By October, vaccine development had progressed. And in recognition of that, the fact that, in fact, if we don't intervene, it is likely that many countries will spend much longer periods before getting access to the vaccines. I think we're seeing some of this beginning to unfold. But the World Bank's board approved in October an additional financing of $12 billion US to help countries, both IDA and IBRD countries, within their existing envelopes, access vaccines, but also be able to deploy the vaccines. Because purchasing the vaccines is only one part of this, the issue. The deployment, effective deployment of the vaccines is also an important element of it. So the $12 billion US that the bank approved was really to enable countries be able to do that. And we've already begun to see countries benefiting from that. The first, Lebanon, for instance, had the board approved $34 million, and I think the vaccines have already arrived in country in Lebanon. Cape Verde, Mongolia, Tajikistan, and more than 30 countries are in the pipeline currently to use those resources made available by the bank to enable them acquire the vaccines, but also deploy the vaccines. One thing that's important is that we're doing this in a complementary manner with COVAX, because all of these countries that I've mentioned are also part of the COVAX initiative. So in a way, it's globally coordinated with the multilateral mechanism that exists, and that it's geared towards helping countries access these vaccines as closely as we can with the sort of higher income countries, which are much further advanced in terms of their deployment of vaccines to their citizens. Now, I mentioned deployment as key. We undertook a country readiness assessment alongside WHO, UNICEF, Gavi, Global Fund, and the bank. In more than 140 countries have now sort of kicked off that process, and more than 126 of them have completed one round of that assessment and are feeding the understanding of the gaps in their readiness into their plans to deploy the vaccines. The assessments, it looked at things like policies for allocation within their country, within countries, pharmacovigilance systems, information systems to track who is getting the vaccine and how it is being deployed, the human resources at the front lines that are needed, the cold chain infrastructure and the logistical capacity, as well as the regulatory capacities, and that they should have a comprehensive plan in a way that allows them to effectively deploy the vaccines that is critical to mitigate the impact of this. In addition, the Global Financing Facility has been working alongside IDA to help protect the gains that we have had in terms of other secondary issues that the pandemic has unleashed: reproductive health, maternal and child health, other diseases that are still unfolding because of the disruption caused by the pandemic. And through the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Multi-Donor Trust Fund, we're also supporting countries to really continue to strengthen their core public health preparedness, because this is a long game. This is not just a 1 year, 2 year issue, and there would be several other infectious disease threats that will be ahead of us. And so we're bringing all of those instruments really to complement what the bank is doing through IDA and IBRD. The private sector is key, and I'm sure you'll hear from my colleague, Thomas Telma, who's a global director at IFC, in terms of what the IFC has been doing. So we look forward to continue to engage with you as we deepen this effort to not only support countries deal with the basic emergency response to the pandemic, but also get access 2 vaccines as soon as possible for their citizens. Over to you, yeah.
That's a super helpful introduction. Thank you so much. And it sounds like you've had to weave together a number of different programs in order to make this work. But I may just come back to a couple of those points. Thomas, let me come over to you. Mohammed talked about the importance of the private sector. It's good to see the IFC standing alongside and standing up programs in support of the World Bank objectives. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and some of the impact that you're making.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this introduction. Thanks for inviting me to this session. Our engagements with all of you are critical to strengthening healthcare systems, and I look forward to this opportunity to discuss IFC's role in how we fight COVID-19 and how your countries are managing and where you see greater efforts needed. As you know, IFC's involvement through investments in the private sector is very important to demonstrate during the pandemic how international community is helping people and businesses survive and thrive. And as we work through our financing to help countries in building foundations for more resilient healthcare systems over time, while making targeted investments to boost the availability of vaccines, strengthening distribution, ensuring that medical devices and PPEs are available. And we all know that support for the private sector is key in this period. Privately held companies dominate manufacturing of healthcare products globally, and on average represent more than 50% of healthcare services in developing countries. So the private sector is therefore at the heart of the solution to address the existing supply challenges and is working urgently to expand the manufacturing and delivery capacity, which requires access to financing, where we come in, but in addition to other support, including de-risking, procurement, and various supply chain solutions. So what has been our focus in the pandemic? In response to the critical health and financing needs, we moved very fast, similar to Mohammed explained on the bank side. First, to really keep the system stabilized through debt relief and liquidity support. We developed new financing packages and programs to support the existing and new clients during this difficult period, and assured continued delivery of health services, materials, and building new private sector capabilities. You know, specifically back in March, we rolled out the 8 billion fast-track financing facility to address the immediate liquidity needs of our clients. To date, more than half, 4.5 billion, have been deployed. Part of this facility includes a $2 billion program for real sector companies, including clients specifically in healthcare. And we have already committed around $800 million across all of IFC, across this facility. That's not just healthcare, that's all of the sectors, but overall, our pandemic response funding, including mobilization to companies in the healthcare sector, up until today is about $500–600 million in the past 10 months. So at a time when healthcare companies are struggling and the needs are growing, this is the sort of financing that makes the difference and saves lives. And I'll just give one example, a company in Ecuador, our client called Conclina, which runs the only internationally accredited hospital in Ecuador. We gave them a loan to expand services for the influx of COVID patients. This is allowing more people to get the care they need and, frankly, saves lives. More recently, we created a major funding facility, the Global Health Platform. Some of you may have heard about it, which targets financing to unlock medical supply bottlenecks and build the resilience in health systems in emerging markets, particularly medical equipment and vaccines, which today, as we know, and you mentioned in the very beginning, are mainly produced in the advanced economies. As of the end of January, the Global Health Platform had about $900 million worth of pipeline of projects under preparation across all regions and in areas such as medtech, pharma manufacturing and distribution, and diagnostic services. Overall, the platform expects to provide about $4 billion of funding, $2 billion of which from IFC's own account, and includes an innovative advisory component to increase the supply of and local production of PPEs in developing countries. For example, we'll help textile companies retool, identify markets, and meet technical specifications. We'll also work with established PPE manufacturers that want to establish local manufacturing base in these various countries. Manufacturers already started signing up on for this program, and I would be amiss if I didn't say that when talking about our advisory work in support of dealing with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on IFC's clients, I didn't express our gratitude to the governments of the UK and Norway and Japan for providing us important grant funding. It's really important to have that kind of support. A few words about vaccines specifically. As they are getting approved, we're looking to fund more vaccine manufacturing and distribution. This is obviously something that all of us are focusing on right now, and we plan to be at the forefront of supporting this effort together with the World Bank. For example, a couple of months ago, we provided a $30 million loan to one of India's top vaccine manufacturers, Biological E Limited, which is known as BioE. Among other things, the money will help the company boost manufacturing capacity for a COVID-19 vaccine. BioE is working on its own vaccine, but they also start producing Johnson & Johnson's vaccine very soon, aiming for 600 million doses a year. We're also actively looking at other pharma companies and partners to see how we can extend this work. There's obviously a lot more to do, and I'm interested in hearing from all of you here how and where more efforts are needed and how we can partner to fight this pandemic. There are a lot of initiatives on their way, and then we would like to be part of them. Thank you.
Incredibly helpful. Just before I come to Ricardo, can I just ask Thomas and Mohammed, any particular, are there any sort of particular obstacles which you're coming across in country after country? Are there any sort of particular standout patterns that you're observing in your work, Mohammed?
I think the key is that the vaccines are not available. We have seen many high-income countries, upper middle-income countries have sort of not only contracted the existing supplies, but also much more than what their populations needed. So financing is only part of it. The fact that there are no vaccines out there, even if you have the resources to be able to get them for a couple of months, you get back in the line, and the line is long. And that's why COVAX, I believe, despite all the great effort, is just beginning to ship out or about to get the vaccines to countries. That's the single most important thing. And if there's a lesson that we should learn, is really to think about globally coordinated, very inclusive ways of organizing production, but also distribution of vaccines. COVAX has been a great start, and I think, but it could do a lot better if the manufacturing capacity and also the contracting was not done as much bilaterally as it has happened.
I'll add one layer to this. I'll add one layer to this. I'll add one layer of complexity, and I think it's beyond manufacturing capacity of vaccines. Yes, there, obviously that's one of the bottlenecks as well. However, what we're hearing from some of the manufacturers especially in developing countries, but not only, is that there is a gap in access to intermediate materials. So in order to produce vaccines, you need to have certain amount of raw materials in order to do that. So manufacturing capacity is building up fairly quickly, and hopefully at least in emerging markets, IFC can be part of expanding that capacity of companies to do that. But there is a gap in supplies of raw materials that go into it. So as a result, in our case, Global Health Platform, which was approved by our board at the end of July last year, the bulk of the work so far has really been on non-vaccine work, on therapeutics, on other things, while the focus on first approving the vaccines and now building up the capacity to produce raw materials and ultimately manufacturing comes into play.
Interesting. So it sounds like the key constraints at the moment are on the vaccine availability rather than the deployment infrastructure.
By far, in our minds.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, super. Right, thank you for getting the discussion going with such eloquent and punchy presentations. Now, really delighted to hand the floor to Ricardo. Ricardo, are you joining us from Portugal today?
I am, yes.
Great. Over to you.
Thank you, Leon. And hello to everyone. Sadly, I am speaking from Portugal because we can't travel, basically. And hopefully we will be together sooner than later as we overcome these difficult times. I know time is of essence, so I'll try to be brief, saying that it is consensual that we need to understand that we will not get our economies fully reopening until we fully control the health crisis we are facing. And we know that the economy and health are two sides of the same coin, and never in modern history have politicians been asked to work on a global health issue with this amount of in-depth knowledge. Like any other recent epidemic or outbreaks, we governmental officials, elected officials, policymakers, the truth is most of us are reacting instead of preventing. And with COVID-19, the truth is we've reacted first with non-clinical tools that we had at our disposal to try to delay the spread of the virus. And then we had to quickly invest in technology and innovation to try to produce diagnostics and therapeutics that could, in an affordable way, be deployed to respond. And now we have vaccines, and we believe that these are, as has been mentioned, a critical tool to solve many of the issues and problems that we are dealing with. And so, being very blunt, we are not going to find easy answers for difficult questions, and rolling out vaccines in high-income countries will not guarantee that those welfare states are secure, that the economy will continue to grow, or that jobs will be produced. Unless we secure health for all, and most importantly, the most vulnerable populations of the world, we will all be vulnerable. And no innovation or science or technology will prevent or save us from an international health and economic crisis. Harder, tougher, and more dramatic than ever ones because of the global goals that have been jeopardized. And we cannot go backwards. That is why we, as members of parliament, congresses, and senates, must take the initiative, leadership, and ownership of our most important duty: to represent and serve our constituencies with needed budget allocation, effective policies, and adequate laws, and to build back better, to attain inclusive growth. By tackling global health security, we must deliver an affordable and equitable and fair distribution of vaccines in low and middle income countries, ensuring political will for universal access to vaccines, and ensure adequate access to international liquidity for these countries. This means fully funding COVAX, for example, and to raise the additional 2.88 billion US dollars that are needed for its objectives of distributing vaccines for the most vulnerable populations in the world, and also ensuring adequate and timely distribution of the excess vaccines from the high-income countries. And with this in mind, and acknowledging that there is a lot of work being done by multilateral organizations, of which, of course, the World Bank and IMF play such an important role. And following what Liam had said, it is with great pleasure that I announce, and I'm very proud to announce on behalf of the Parliamentary Network of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and also on behalf of the Unite Parliamentarians Network to End Infectious Diseases, that we will be creating and launching, as of today, a working group dedicated to global health. And I call on all of our esteemed colleagues from around the world, if they have interest in being part of this working group, to flag their interest to our secretariats. We believe that this working group, as part of our organization, is important as a way to show our unprecedented commitment from a wide range of officials in bringing together global health security with social and economic recovery to build back better while preparing, preventing, and protecting our most vulnerable populations against future pandemics, and reinstall trust, transparency between governments, international organizations, by holding these accountables with the power that these legislators have. We commit to ensure then transparency and political accountability to multilateral commitments, increase political advocacy towards initiatives like COVAX and other pillars of Act A, and rebuilding our economic models by enabling an agenda of inclusive and effective policies that can be official in the new post-pandemic world. It is therefore our ambition to bring together different institutions and partners to utilize the synergic political power of all of our networks to the attainment of our ambitious goals. And of course, to make sure that the SDGs continue to be the beacon that leads the way towards 2030, and to make sure that we do not lose track of the commitments we have made in the past. Now more than ever, and to end, the people need their representatives to be up to the challenge of working beyond our own short-term political cycles and preparing for the future. This is our moral obligation. I believe this is our destiny. It is in our hands to make sure no one is left behind, and failure is not an option. Thank you.
Ricardo, thank you so much indeed for that. As we head into some of the international meetings that we've got coming up over the course of the year, we will be using the Parliamentary Network to help mobilize calls to action on international and multilateral institution leaders. And so the initiative that Ricardo talked about is incredibly welcome and important, and will be a key part of that mobilization effort. I'm going to head over to the Philippines now, and I'm going to ask Pia, who is chair of the Sustainable Development Goals Committee there in the Philippines, to now take the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted. Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to share the Philippine experience. Just a little bit of background. I do chair the Committee on Sustainable Development Goals, Innovation and Futures Thinking in the Senate, but I also happen to chair the Committee on Ways and Means, and I will talk a little bit about our taxation efforts with regards to COVID. And I also am the vice chair for our Committee on Finance, and I handle the budget of the Department of Health, especially the response to COVID. So coming from that, and one last background is I am the chapter head of Unite, which our founder, Ricardo Batista late just spoke earlier. So I'm very happy I'm a happy sponge in these virtual conferences, as I learn a lot from colleagues from all over the world. And I hope that I can also share a few things in the process. So very quickly, what we did in the Philippines is we passed two major laws in the early days of COVID. As a quick response, we provided the president with emergency powers to respond. And in those early days, the question was really the testing capacity. And then we had a second law wherein we tackled more technical aspects. We learned a little bit more and matured a little in our legislation. And we gave the power to it's called the Health Technology Assessment Council, the power to make the recommendations based on ongoing phase 4 trials, because by law, they cannot make the recommendations for government to purchase until after these are all concluded. So we empowered them to do that, only to find out a few months later that the world would be purchasing vaccines as they were still going through phase 3 trials. So now we are in the process of passing that law that also allows them to make those purchases during the phase 3 trial. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, I chaired the Committee on Ways and Means, which is taxation in our country. And we passed a major legislation that really has to do with investment, making the country a more investment-friendly country, not necessarily COVID-related. But because we are living in the time of COVID, we included provisions that provide for duties and VAT-free, value-added tax-free importation of the COVID vaccines. And then we realized that there's also donations. We did not include donations. So now we have another law that is being tackled, and that will now include donations. So very quickly, I do want to discuss this bill that we have in the Senate. And it tackles the legal limitations that we face in procuring vaccines. I don't know how it is in other countries, but in our country, we have very strong procurement laws that basically are there to address graft and corruption. And so we are not allowed to make advanced purchases. The national government and the local government cannot just make advanced purchases. That is not allowed under procurement laws. So in the previous COVID response law, we allowed national government to work around that. But as it turns out, we have exemptions when it comes to multilateral loans. And so multilateral loans do not have to comply with these procurement requirements, and that makes it easier for the national government to access these funds immediately. But the interesting twist here is that meanwhile, our local government chiefs are getting anxious. Our country still does not have, I think our first batch is arriving anytime now. So we have not been, no one has been vaccinated in our country yet compared to many other countries. And so the local governments have demanded the right to also procure for themselves. And I have been awaiting the availability of the founder of our Unite Parliamentary Network to have a discussion with me on this, because we do know that there are pros and cons on, we want to empower the local governments, but from my, from what I read all over the world, vaccines are being procured by the federal governments nationally. So how to go about this in a way that does not disenfranchise or discriminate those who are not on the priority list of those who are able to procure it some other way. And this is actually now a nationwide call of a network of doctors in our country, that they worry that if it is not centralized, if the procurement isn't centralized, if local governments and or the private sector purchase on their own, that they may not follow the priorities that the national government has accepted in line with the COVAX scheme. So those are issues that we're facing. And we also have a major issue on vaccine hesitancy. I don't know how big of a problem that is in other countries. I have not heard as much as I'd like to, but there was a survey done in the Philippines, and 3 out of 10 only are willing to be vaccinated. And this may be because of our history, because we had a big Dengvaxia issue a few years ago. And long story, not enough time to explain it now, but it basically scared so many families, parents, and so they are not very comfortable with vaccination at this point. So those are a few of the issues that we currently face right now.
Well, I can tell you that the issue around vaccine hesitancy is an issue for all of us. I mean, I represent the poorest community in our country, and we've got some pretty significant problems there that we're really battling to overcome. Any other sort of particular barriers to vaccine rollout that you want to highlight here?
Well, logistically, we are a country of 7,000 islands, 7,000 plus. And so, for example, to be specific, the Pfizer vaccine that requires a very cold temperature, we have already been told that it would be rolled out only in the metropolitan areas, because that is the areas that currently have the storage facilities. The other provinces would have to make use of the other vaccines that don't have the same cold storage requirement. So I mean, every day there are new issues that come about. But
I mean, this may, I mean, I don't know what Ricardo thinks, but I mean, these are some of the things that we may be able to sweep up in a lessons learned exercise.
Yes, exactly. And really, who are considered frontliners? Everybody has their own advocacy group of who are frontliners. Some are of the position that you cannot just literally support the frontliners, because one line I heard is that, well, who will manage them? So you have to include the managers.
Ricardo, do you want to just comment on that very briefly, just before I bring in Sabina from Kenya?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that lessons learned is a critical approach that many times we as parliamentarians don't take as seriously as we can. And so I think as a network, and this best practice sharing can be useful moving forward. And what Pia is saying is extremely important when we speak about the front line, because the impression one gets looking at the impact of COVID in different countries and the way policies are designed in terms of priorities is that those that have stronger unions or stronger voices in the community tend to be considered, and those that don't tend to be left behind. And so we have to, as policymakers, once again, we have to have that bird-eye view to make sure that all of those involved in the response are having the adequate policies put in place for them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I know that, I mean, in the UK, there's a pretty clear relationship between poverty, testing uptake, and vaccine hesitancy. It's a perfect storm that means actually the poorest will be hit hardest. Right, let's go to Kenya now. Sabina, are you there? Sabina is the chair of the Health Committee in the Kenyan Parliament. So we'd love to hear a perspective from you if you're there. Hello, Sabina. Right, we're going to try and come back to Sabina because I think she's got some connection problems. So let's go to Lebanon. Fadi, Lebanon has been one of the first countries in which vaccine has been deployed under the World Bank scheme that we heard about just a few moments ago. Let me hand the floor to you so we can hear from you.
Yes. Hi, Liam.
Hi there.
And hi, with regard to the speakers and the panelists and whoever is attending today's session. Lebanon faces a combination of balance of payment crisis, an economic and banking sector crisis, plus a 10-year humanitarian situation caused by the influx of displaced Syrians to the country. Add to all this, and then we have the COVID-19 pandemic and the explosion of the Beirut port back in August. This situation in the country is further compounded by the lockdown measures, which pose a serious threat to Lebanon's health system and economy, particularly affecting the poor and the vulnerable. As a brief refresher, corona refresher, Lebanon's stats since almost a year ago exactly stand at a total of 343,000 positive cases, 4,092 deaths up until yesterday, and a recent average positive cases per 1,000, and it stands at about 19.7%. It went up to 23%, now we're back to 19.7. With vaccines becoming readily available, the Lebanese government, similar to other countries of the world, realized the prudent evidence-based ultimatum to combat COVID-19 infections, which is to begin practically mass vaccination through proper legislations and adequate funding, utilizing the World Bank's Lebanon Health Resilience Project, the LHRP. Initially, that specific project was intended to strengthen the government's healthcare capacity at a budget of $120 million. And which was ratified by the Lebanese parliament back in 2018. But due to the corona pandemic, parliament moved to amend the LHRP package agreement in March of 2020 by reallocating $40 million to strengthen the Ministry of Public Health capacity to respond to COVID-19, mainly testing equipment, plus covering some of the COVID-19 related hospitalization bills, which helped a lot the private sector when we spoke about, and I heard the IFC talk about this issue. With vaccine becoming readily available, we requested and got the World Bank's approval to reallocate $34 million to support the purchase and deployment of COVID-19 vaccine. So we also heard about that. We were the very first, I think, the very first country to get that specific funding. Although being the World Bank's first direct vaccine funding, the progress moved fairly quickly. The Health Committee, whom I'm a member of, prepared and submitted a draft law to the General Assembly within 4 days. Key components of the legislation was waiving vaccine manufacturers' liabilities for up to 2 years in the event of serious related illnesses, structuring a compensation fund, and forming an audit committee to review cases and award compensations when and if warranted. That was a specific mandate by most of the manufacturers to ensure that they're not being sued and that we, the government of Lebanon, bear the responsibility until they complete their files, their marketing and other documents related. This specific legislation paved the way for the first Pfizer vaccine delivery back on February 13th, which is last Saturday, I think, or Sunday. The law, which passed unanimously, regulated the emerging use of medical products, including vaccines, to combat COVID-19 pandemic. Within 5 days, post-parliamentary approval, Ministry of Public Health signed a contract with Pfizer for the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines, and the World Bank's board of directors approved the reallocation of $34 million, allowing the Ministry of Public Health to transfer its obligations to secure 2 million vaccines for the country. Again, the first batch was received or delivered actually 4 days ago. As part of its oversight role, the Healthcare Parliamentary Committee was involved in the launch of the National Deployment Vaccination Plan for COVID-19, ensuring transparent, just, and equitable distribution without any political bias or interference. So far, in the last 4 days, we've managed to do very good. We launched a platform, people registered to the platform. The plan is going according to the platform. The platform itself and the algorithm, the artificial intelligence behind the platform itself ensured that no politics as usual take place. And then whoever needs to get the vaccine is getting the vaccine according to their age and occupation and the targeted population that they have set up to target. One final remark also was to check on the distribution of the vaccine sites, ensuring that we get equitable and well-spread geographical coverage for the vaccine, so people have the access and the option to get vaccinated where they want to be vaccinated. So we have about 34 accredited vaccine centers so far in the country, of 4 million or 5 million with the refugees. One final remark on the oversight role. I would personally like to see more involvement by the Parliament towards monitoring successful communication plans and strong promotional campaigns aimed at A, convincing skeptical individuals, motivating them to take the vaccine. That's a big challenge. B, to improve health literacy regarding COVID-19 and improve misconceptions. In this regard, I believe tougher legislations sanctioning fake news and disinformation will nicely do. Finally, I look forward towards sustained collaboration with the WHO and other international partners in our efforts to end this pandemic, which is a common responsibility. Many thanks for your valuable time. Please be safe and get vaccinated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fadi, how significant was the $34 million?
It's been very essential because what we did through the COVAX, we insured about 2.7 million vaccines. And then through the 34 million, we insured about 2 million. And now the government is working on another 1 million. So that's going to put us close to the 6 million vaccines. It's not close enough to cover the herd immunity platform, I mean the target, but at least it's going to get us very close.
Yeah, okay, that's okay. Very useful and very interesting that you've also got issues around fake news as well. That is something that we are really, really worried about. Monica Gonzalez, I don't know if you're in Spain or in Brussels, but if I can come to you now, you've got an extraordinary record campaigning and standing up for both people with disabilities, migrants, and give us a perspective either from the European point of view or from a Spanish point of view. It's your call. Over to you.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, principalmente al presidente de la red parlamentaria del Banco Mundial, el honorable Liam Bernie. Muchas gracias por darme la palabra y por invitarme a participar de este evento, ¿no? Es un placer escuchar al director mundial de salud del Banco Mundial, el señor Mohamed Pate. Creo que su intervención ha sido magnífica. Yo estoy en Bruselas ahora mismo, pero muy conectada con la realidad política y la realidad de lo que vivimos en España. Constantemente voy y vengo. Me siento honrada, obviamente, por participar en este espacio con parlamentarios de todo el mundo, personas con profundo conocimiento ámbito de la salud, de Kenia, Líbano, Filipinas y Portugal. Yo no soy especialista en salud, ahora mismo formo parte de la Comisión de Desarrollo del Parlamento Europeo y por lo tanto estamos abocados, trabajando desde mi despacho firmemente para impulsar esto, que si queremos que la vacuna sea un bien público global, esto significa que tiene que llegar a los países en desarrollo, a los países de renta media y renta baja. Espero en estos minutos asignados poder hablar un poquito de los retos globales que afrontamos y las posibles soluciones o recomendaciones que estamos impulsando desde el Parlamento Europeo, ¿no? Efectivamente necesitamos dotarnos de una estrategia mundial de vacunación, sino lo que estamos hablando de ser un bien público global no se va a producir, y tenemos un primer reto que ya lo ha expuesto Mohamed Pate sobre la visión las estrategias que han emergido con una visión nacionalista de la vacunación y con lo que obstaculiza, ¿no?, los planes globales para el acceso universal y equitativo. Según informes que seguramente son de vuestro conocimiento, el Instituto de Salud Global de Universidad de Duque habla que el 60% de las vacunas comprometidas han sido adquiridas por un grupo de países ricos que representan solo el 16% de la población mundial. Esto ha provocado ineficiencias, obviamente, en el mecanismo COVAX de la Organización Mundial de la Salud para el acceso universal. COVAX pretende garantizar estos más de 2 millones de dosis para finales del 2021, pero sin embargo tener dinero no asegura de que puedas adquirir las dosis, ¿no? La falta de una estrategia mundial puede poner en riesgo, obviamente, los avances de una vacunación parcial, y dos ejemplos a citar. Uno es, por ejemplo, el que estamos denunciando desde el Parlamento Europeo, de que mientras en Europa los 27 Estados miembros tenemos la perspectiva o la aspiración de estar vacunados el 70% de la población antes del verano, el resto de los 145 países que integran COVAX, según los datos que hemos recibido recientemente en el Parlamento Europeo, solo podrían cubrir el 3,3% de su población, ¿no? Yo antes de entrar a esta reunión veía los datos de vacunación con fecha del lunes 15 de ahora de febrero, y veía que mientras Israel había llegado al 30% de su población dentro del entorno europeo, España es de la que está más alta, ¿no?, junto con Dinamarca, con Malta, son países que están alrededor del 2,29, 2,30% de su población, o en el ámbito latinoamericano, Argentina con el 0,53, o México como el 0,07 de su población. Estamos hablando que a alguno de los países COVAX recién le va a llegar su vacuna en el 2022 o 2023. Creo que esta es la brecha entre la compra bilateral, que está haciendo la compra bilateral con las farmacéuticas, y el acceso vía COVAX generará nuevas desigualdades en la recuperación económica y problemas sanitarios con la evolución de las nuevas cepas, ¿no? Brechas que vienen a sumarse a las ya existentes. Y otro es que en Israel se ha conseguido dar la primera dosis al 38%, 39% de su población, de sus 9 millones de habitantes, y la segunda al 21% de su población, pero el virus sigue expandiéndose entre la población palestina, ¿no?, del cual se han totalmente desentendido. Por mucho que los países ricos vacunen a gran parte de sus habitantes, el virus seguirá circulando y evolucionando, haciendo invulnerable las vacunas, ¿no? Así que yo creo que debemos defender la solidaridad frente a la pandemia en una estrategia mundial de vacunación por eficacia médica, por supuesto, lo estáis diciendo todos, por razones económicas y por razones humanitarias fundamentalmente, de los cuales los europeos tenemos el gran honor de ser los primeros donantes del mundo en ayuda humanitaria y en desarrollo, ¿no? Como parlamentarios es nuestro deber, por un lado, presionar a la Comisión Europea y también presionar a nuestros propios gobiernos que forman el Consejo de la Unión Europea para que favorezcan la solidaridad internacional y una respuesta multilateral, ¿no? Hasta la fecha la Unión Europea, como sabéis, ha movilizado más de 38 millones de euros para responder al COVID que forma parte del Team Europe, ¿no?, de la estrategia común de los 27 Estados miembros, y ha participado en COVAX con 853 millones de euros y prepara un mecanismo propio para donar a través de COVA los más de 2,3 millones de dosis, ¿no? España es uno de los países que más ha impulsado la iniciativa, dando, por ejemplo, que tiene un plan propio plan de acceso universal, donde cifra la cantidad de dosis, donde cifra la prioridad de países de renta baja y renta media, y que en su primera capa la donación va a ir a los países del Mediterráneo, ¿no? Obviamente porque son nuestros vecinos, es la frontera más cercana que tenemos español. Pero la ayuda a Europa no es suficiente, no necesitamos que las farmacéuticas se comprometan seriamente, más allá de los preacuerdos actuales, por hasta 700 millones de dosis, que no son contratos firmes, ¿no? El segundo gran reto creo que es la insuficiente capacidad de fabricación mundial, que genera escasez en la vacuna y retrasos en la vacunación, ¿no? Desde el Parlamento Europeo hemos exigido a la Comisión Europea y a los Estados miembros impulsen contratos entre laboratorios y fabricantes genéricos en países en desarrollo para elevar la capacidad mundial de fabricación y reducir el retraso de la vacunación, ¿no? La Comisión Europea nos ha informado, en una asociación con Alemania, ha empezado a desarrollar la capacidad local de fabricación de productos farmacéuticos en el sur de África, pero verdad que no tenemos mucho más información que esta que acabo de decir. Para superar este proceso complejo de fabricación mundial, entiendo que necesitamos inversión urgente de gobiernos y organismos multilaterales, pues hasta ahora hemos prestado toda la atención al desarrollo de vacunas y necesitamos esforzarnos en la fabricación, ¿no? Por ello hemos pedido una conferencia de donantes, igual que se hace para otros tipos de emergencia, una conferencia de donantes que potencie la fabricación mundial y la vacunación en los países en desarrollo, y para esto la ayuda del Banco Mundial es fundamental, y se sumaría a la respuesta de emergencia al COVID de 160.000 millones de dólares anunciada en el pasado 2020. La transferencia de tecnología condicionará a la velocidad con la que se generen capacidades para fabricar vacunas. En este sentido, entiendo que se necesita compartir el conocimiento, la propiedad intelectual y los datos que aceleran el proceso, ¿no? Entre las opciones para compartir el conocimiento estaría la excepción temporal de los derechos de propiedad intelectual, como lo solicita India y Sudáfrica en el Consejo TRIPS, también la flexibilización de obligaciones bajo la declaración de Doha, y que los países titulares de patente expidan licencias obligatorias, lo cual ya se reconoce en el derecho europeo en el reglamento 816/2006 sobre la concesión de licencias obligatorias de patentes relativas a la fabricación de productos farmacéuticos. Esos son los debates que están hoy en el Parlamento Europeo y que quería compartirlos con ustedes. El próximo 10 de marzo habrá un debate decisivo en la Organización Mundial de Comercio, y creo que desde el Parlamento Europeo estamos impulsando que la Unión Europea tenga un rol decisivo de buscar un consenso, ¿no? Como actor global para acercar posiciones y liderar este debate. El consenso es imprescindible para alcanzar una solución mundial. Creo que todos los parlamentarios deberíamos contactar a nuestros gobiernos para que expliquen qué harán el próximo 10 de marzo en la OMC. Muchísimas gracias, disculparme si me he extendido un poquito más, me quedan temas pendientes que me gustaría compartir, como el nuevo instrumento de cooperación INDICI y otros instrumentos europeos, pero me quiero sujetar al tiempo que nos habéis asignado.
Monica, that was incredibly comprehensive, thank you. It would be incredibly helpful if there's more that you want to say on some of those instruments, if you could share those with us so that we can circulate them around the network as well. And in particular, the point you make about parliamentarians calling on their governments ahead of the WTO meeting, that's something that we'd love to share around the network as well. So we've got about 35 minutes for questions. I know, Mohammed, you've got to leave us shortly. There are about 5 key questions that have come up, which let me just put to Mohammed and Thomas, but other on our panel, please chip in, just wave at me if you want to come in. So the first question is, how close are we to getting a timeline for vaccine deployment at the scale that we need to vaccinate the world? We've heard a lot about vaccine scarcity. We've heard about some of the constraints on the supply, but we also know in lots of different countries, the daily cost of lockdown is so significant, and it is driving tens of millions of people into extreme poverty. So a perspective on how close we are to the timeline would be really useful. The second question that has come up is about deployment infrastructure. Although we've heard today that there are problems with vaccine scarcity, there are obviously concerns in many countries about deployment infrastructure. So a view on that would be very helpful. There's then this extremely important question about whether annual vaccinations, or certainly regular vaccinations, will now need to be a feature of our lives, given the pace with which mutations are occurring and the dangers of some of those new mutations. And we've got a sort of a final question, which is about the risks of vaccine hesitancy. So a question really about the role of political leaders in trying to conquer vaccine hesitancy. And this point about fake news is something that I think needs a bit of attention as well. Mohammed, perhaps I could come to you first to pick up any or indeed all of those points, and then I'll come.
Thank you. So I'll start, and I'm sure my other co-panelists can be able to respond to some of them. Let me start with the issue of the annual vaccination, or what we see down coming along in this direction. With the variants, it's likely that boosters may be required, but we also have another dimension, which is that the efficacy of some vaccines, as we've seen with the Novavax, even with the AstraZeneca in South Africa, that there may be, in fact, some inequality built in, where some vaccines that are, let's say, only partly effective are available, and some vaccines that may be higher, more effective, available elsewhere. That's something to be watchful for, to ensure that we don't have a two-track world of the haves who have the best quality vaccines, and then others who have sort of much less efficacious, but vaccines nonetheless. So that's the other dimension on that. This is still unfolding. I think the studies are sort of being carried out to understand things like cross-vaccination, using one vaccine to start and another as a second dose, or even newer or other forms of vaccines, inactivated vaccines. To what extent will they be able to deal with the variants? Because the front runners are mostly platform vaccines. These are vaccines that are targeted at a specific part of the virus. Now, traditionally, we've done vaccines with the viruses as inactivated or attenuated viruses, which give a full repertoire of immunity. We don't know yet the answer, but I think this is worth keeping an eye, and I'm sure WHO and other groups of experts will give appropriate recommendation on how best to approach vaccination strategy, given the variants that are also unfolding. Now, on the issue of the horizon, at the moment, I think COVAX has given the most clarity in terms of the sort of globally coordinated mechanism for when countries can expect the doses based on what it has already secured in terms of commitment to the manufacturing companies. It has given that and distributed those allocations to countries starting from first quarter 2021 to first half of 2021 and to the second half of 2021. Most countries will get the bulk of their doses from COVAX in the second half of 2021. There will be a continuation of the bilateral deals, but I suspect that the intense vaccination, about 50% in many of our countries, will not occur before 2022. We would get enough vaccines ultimately, unless, let's say, those countries that have actually committed lots of doses are willing to donate them or exchange them, because that's also another dimension that can change. But we don't know that at the moment, given the variants that are unfolding. So it's a bit clearer than where we were, let's say, in October, when the bank approved its first 12 billion. But it's not fully clear in terms of the timeline on when the countries will get to the 50, 60, 70% of their populations in terms of the lower income countries and low income countries. I think the deployment infrastructure, I mentioned the vaccine readiness assessment that we have carried out with WHO and others, that pointed to the fact that there is some minimal capacity that exists in many countries in cold chain, not for the Pfizer and ultra-chain cold chain, but for the routine cold chain, for a certain percentage of populations to be immunized on a routine basis. most countries can be able to take on that to start. So that's not an excuse. So the lack of delivery infrastructure is really not an excuse for why countries cannot start vaccinating. But there are gaps that will need to be filled, some of which are hard gaps in terms of infrastructure, some of which are training of human resources, some of which are infrastructure for information, like we have heard from Honorable Fadi in Lebanon, in terms of the platform to track who gets what and to organize it. So those are all things that can be built as the vaccines begin to roll out. And the final point, a very important one on vaccine hesitancy. At the end of the day, vaccine hesitancy is real. It's lack of trust, but it's also coming from 3 points. One of which is just lack of adequate information or misinformation. But part of it is also historical. And part of it is also who is actually conveying, what are those channels, and are they legitimate and trustworthy to the populations? So I think that's an area that all of us, leaders everywhere, have to sort of earn the trust of their population by being transparent, by being very truthful, and there will be mishaps. So if you have adverse events, be able to go out and actually be able to confront it, not to sweep it under the rug. I think the first role that leaders can play is actually being open and honest with their populations, whether the good or the bad. And that is the way to earn the trust, so that the population believes and are able to come through and get immunized. Otherwise, I think we'll have a very long slog in many countries to get many of the population, many people to actually believe that the vaccines are safe and efficacious. So I'll stop here, and my other co-panelists can complement what
Thank you very much. As a scientist, you may not want to speculate about hunches that you've got, but do you suspect that we may need to be organizing an infrastructure where we are a world that is having regular kind of boosters or new vaccines in the future? Is that your suspicion?
Yes. At this moment, I think that's my suspicion, that it will take, this is not a one-time game. This is a serial game.
Right, that's the point. Okay. It's so important, because what a lot of us in parliaments around the world are having to do is to try and make sure that we've synchronized the economic and financial support measures with the testing and vaccination rollout. And if it is the case that we're not really going to start making significant progress on vaccinating the world, and particularly those in the developing world, until 2022, that's got really big implications for the kind of economic support package that the global community has to ensure is available. Thomas, do you want to comment on any particular aspect of that?
I'll pick up maybe 1 or 2 points. As a non-scientist, you're not going to get me to talk about vaccine hesitancy or a couple of other aspects of the questions that you've summarized. But maybe just one quick reaction on the annual vaccination requirements. As a financing person, as a non-scientist, I think it just, and a development economist, I think it really reminds us about the gaps in developing countries and emerging markets in deployment capabilities of any kinds of vaccines. Previously we had pandemics of various sorts, but they were very localized, regionalized. This one is actually on the example of advanced economies that are struggling with deployment, is showing us how big of a gap we're actually likely to see when more of a vaccine is available for emerging markets and developing countries. And I think, as Mohammed said, this is for a long haul. This is not a one-time event. I think the opportunity that we all have to actually create much greater capacity for diagnostics, for deployment of vaccines for this pandemic and for any subsequent pandemic is quite significant. And that's something that's in front of us. And maybe one specific point of the original list that you suggested, I think the deployment infrastructure, again, the experience of advanced economies that have been deploying since December, the approved vaccines have showed us how many gaps exist in countries which should have capacity to do this much better. As we go to places like the Philippines, and then we heard about the 7,000 islands, how do we actually do this, and how do we prepare in advance of the availability of vaccine is super critical. And it's really important that we begin to also think of customizing which particular vaccine, which particular product is the most suitable for certain countries. So perhaps again, speculating, perhaps the Pfizer vaccine is not going to be easy to deploy in a country which is so dispersed logistically and the most difficult, in terms of the cold storage requirements. However, there are other variants and other vaccines which are becoming available, which have a broader range of, how they're kept. And, what we've been doing at IFC is really trying to see how we can reach out to some of the logistics companies and companies that are involved in a cold storage and even food supply chains in our countries to begin to prepare the capacity for handling, vaccines that ultimately will become, available. And it goes into other parts of the whole healthcare infrastructure and healthcare system. Do we have enough ICUs for treatments? Do we have enough access to diagnostic and treatment services? It goes beyond the vaccine in many countries, especially for mild cases. There are many ways of helping the patients, which we've discovered in the advanced economies, which developing countries do not have. Can we actually use this pandemic as a way to build the resilience for the systems longer term and create a capacity to diagnose, to treat, to distribute different kinds of treatments, vaccines, or whatever. So I think in some ways the pandemic is the opportunity for us to actually focus on the gaps that have been revealed in developing countries through this whole challenge.
I'd like to come back to some of our panelists for their views on a couple of these questions in a second, but there's just another little group of questions that I'd quite like to put to you both. So one is around the risk of either new variants or resistance building up if it takes too long for us to deploy the vaccine. So is there a risk that we take so long to deploy the vaccine that the mutations basically outstrip our ability to vaccinate on the one hand? Is there a risk of resistance to vaccines building up is the other question that's been put. The second question is then around patents and technology transfer. And if you have views on what the international community might need to do to change some of these constraints, I think that would be quite an interesting reflection from you. And then there is this question that has come up from a few of our participants today about pricing and what the international community may need to do about just ensuring that vaccines are cheaper and therefore more abundant for those countries that are poorer. Mohammed, could you pick up any of those, do you think?
Yes, let me start on the issue of the evolution of the virus. The virus is an evolutionary fight. It's changing and it will continue to do so. It's an RNA virus. Ideally, we mount immunity using the vaccination sort of as closely coordinated as possible all over the world. The haphazard and delay in vaccination in one part of the world versus the other, in a way, will encourage selection of viruses that are able to evade, let's say, the vaccines that we currently have. So we will be in this perpetual cycle. It's already beginning to happen when you look at the variants that are emerging in different parts of the world. And the longer we keep that, even if you fully vaccinate your population, then you select those other variants that are able to evade the immune response from that vaccine, and that can establish itself back in your population in the long run. So definitely it's not the ideal situation. In a way, there's no way that one world or one part of the world can be able to protect itself against something that is affecting the entire humanity. The virus itself it's really approaching this from an evolutionary standpoint. And as human beings, we have to be smart enough to look at the weakest links in the humanities chain is the most important vulnerability that we have. And so to the extent that we have these glaring inequalities in access to vaccines between countries and within countries, then we're not doing ourselves the smartest thing that we can do in fighting a virus that is coming to us from an evolutionary perspective, that is trying to really outsmart the human race to establish itself. So that's on that. And I think the resistance issue is all connected, really, because the virus is mutating in how it attacks us, how it really causes disease, and changing based on how we're able to fight back, either in terms of our immune responses or through the vaccination that provokes particular types of immune responses. So on the trade issue, I don't know whether Thomas wants to take on that. I think for vaccine manufacturing, the patent issue, I think is slightly different than what you have for the pharmaceuticals, because the manufacturing for vaccines requires several other things beyond just the intellectual property in a way. And Thomas mentioned the whole sets of inputs that are needed that may not always be available. And having said that, there are several vaccine candidates. Now we're talking about the front runners, but there may be other vaccines that will come that are more traditional, that are cheaper, easier to administer, and they may be more widely able to be manufactured. Because these vaccines that we have in the front run were the ones that we can be able to produce fastest, and they are using platforms, and they may be adaptable and they have all their advantages. But they may also be more complex to handle, like we've seen with the mRNA virus with Pfizer. And they may also be sort of targeted at just one part of the virus, unlike, let's say, inactivated virus vaccines and other vaccines that may come in. So if history is a guide, vaccines tend to improve over time in terms of the quality, but also, I believe, in terms of the pricing. So we may not continue to see this high pricing over time, because there are many other vaccines in the run at this moment in different clinical trials. The first 3, 4, 5 are the front runners, and they are very important that we get them there. But I believe in a year or two, we'll see a lot more other types of vaccines, which may be cheaper and easier to administer. And they may be easier to manufacture even in the developing countries. But Thomas may want to add to that. Yeah.
That's an incredibly useful perspective. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, so I would add on technology transfer, because it's a very critical piece. And of course, it's all over the news now, because there are so few originators of vaccine that are actually in a position to be deploying anything, right? So as a result, you hear of those potential tie-ups between the manufacturers of vaccines that have already been approved and the manufacturers of vaccines in developing countries. And by and large, the arrangements, at least that we know about, are very restrictive and narrow arrangements. So a contract manufacturer of a vaccine of a advanced economy originator may only be able to produce a vaccine to sell back to the originator, or perhaps to sell back to the originator and to distribute in their own country. So how can we as an international community impress on the importance and on the urgency of maybe on some of the originators to allow for a greater access of vaccines manufactured under contract from those originators beyond their domestic market? So maybe a company in India can be selling not just in India and back to the originator, but more broadly. And the pattern follows for many others. So I think that's one specific area where international community can perhaps open things up a little bit and create a greater opportunity for access to vaccines in more markets. The other point, we've all, learned how concentrated production of vaccines and the capacity to produce vaccines is, in the past year when we focus on the pandemic. The problem has been there all along. There are very few countries around the world that have that capacity. So one of the things that we're trying to do is, can we actually, through the experience of this pandemic, diversify the capacity to produce vaccines into more markets, into more countries, especially developing countries around the world? How do you expand it in Africa to places where ultimately, not just for COVID-19, but for others in the future, can have the capacity to produce the adequate vaccines. I think that's a big important discovery and realization that we can hopefully deal with through this pandemic.
Yeah. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes to go, so I'd quite like to zero in on this question about what do you think parliamentarians can do with the people we represent, but also what do we think we need our governments to be doing, potentially in multilateral institutions. But can I just, before I put those questions to you, can I just come back to our panelists? Monica, I saw you nodding away with some of what you were hearing there. Were there any points there that you wanted just to sort of pick up and develop a little bit?
No, muy breve, solamente asentía porque creo que es un placer escuchar ¿cómo es? A Mohamed Pate, y que coincido plenamente en que obviamente no se trata solo de que en el caso del Parlamento Europeo, nuestros compañeros que abordan desde la Comisión de Comercio Internacional la cuestión de flexibilizar licencias, de poder avanzar hacia una cuestión, digamos, puramente de comercio, sino que también es mucho más complejo, que merece toda una gestión de insumos que no siempre están disponibles en todos los países. Por lo tanto, el tema es mucho más complejo que pedir libremente la liberalización de las patentes o de la propiedad intelectual. Yo creo que efectivamente tenemos cierta responsabilidad los países llamados ricos, ¿no? Los países del entorno, por ejemplo, de los 27 que forman la Unión Europea, tenemos una responsabilidad adicional, ¿no? Si queremos ser un actor global, esto también tiene que ver con un posicionamiento estratégico, dado que otras regiones del mundo ya lo están haciendo en determinadas áreas geográficas como Latinoamérica o como África, ¿no? Eso es lo que estamos evaluando desde el Parlamento Europeo y pidiéndole a la Comisión respuestas más rápidas. Por un lado, lo comercial, la liberalización de patentes, pero por otro lado también un posicionamiento estratégico a la hora de demostrar nuestra solidaridad y seguir manteniendo esta posición de ser los primeros donantes del mundo, los primeros en llevar los valores europeos a otras regiones del mundo. Nada más y muchísimas gracias. Me debo retirar también porque tengo otro evento al que acudir, tengo que firmar una serie de vídeos para aquí, para el Parlamento, así que os ruego mil disculpas, pero me tengo que despedir. Un placer.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and do share some of the things that you were referring to. Thank you, Monica. Ricardo, there's quite a lot there to pick up, but I think there's also quite a lot of input for the working group that you talked about earlier.
Well, we have a lot of work ahead of us. No there's no doubt there. I mean, it's quite contradictory in a way if we look at the way we have been responding to the COVID crisis. And in many aspects, when we look at vaccine development, we are seeing advancements that bewilders us as scientists, as politicians, the immense advancements. But at the same time, from a policy perspective, as policymakers keeping governments accountable, we are applying the same methodologies and policies that were used basically in the 1918 pandemic and many others before that. And so there's this contradiction of terms between how policy has not been able to learn from lessons of the past and how we tend to repeat the same mistakes. And that is where I think multilateral organizations, where parliamentarian networks like ours can play such an important role in also preserving those best practices into the future. And you know what you're saying, what you said, Liam, about the variants, how basically vaccinations are probably here to say. Mohammed was very clear on how this is a marathon. The truth is, we're already seeing technological firms developing one-shot, multiple agent vaccines and other kinds of solutions that may be available in the future, which means that from a policy perspective, we need to start to prepare the countries around the world for those kind of innovations and technologies. On another hand, in terms of distribution, even in terms of production, of course, you know, I come from infectious disease as a physician, having worked a lot in HIV and AIDS, And during the AIDS pandemic, we dealt with licensing issues, trying to get important drugs across the market into low and middle income countries. And those kind of approaches, working with WTO, as we heard, those are all extremely important. But we need to do more. And I think that we have not been able to apply also the kind of innovation and research and development capacities to the production and distribution lines the same way we have in terms of the development. And so I would say that as policymakers, we have multiple challenges ahead. First of all, is to make sure that the best policies are being applied, and especially the non-pharmacological ones, where lockdowns are the worst option available. Lockdowns are used basically when everything else failed. And so we need to acknowledge that and make sure that we are more preventive than reactive when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. But also we have a responsibility in terms of resource allocation. And that is not just through our domestic budgets, but also through multilateral organizations as member states, the World Bank, IMF, and many others. And so making sure that the money is going where it is needed to make sure that we are better prepared in the future. And so across the board, and I'll stop here, but across the board, I'd say that.
Can I just ask you, can you just pick up something that we were talking about earlier in the week, which was about transparency and oversight? Because a couple of the questions that are coming up in the chat really reveal an anxiety about the lack of transparency in markets and potentially the risk of corruption in distribution of vaccines. And I know this was something that you were talking about on our board meeting a bit earlier in the week.
Yeah, and Percy, also another vice chair of our network, was also mentioning this, and how opaque contracts contradict what we want in terms of transparency. And there is no reason, at least that I can understand, for these contracts not to be of public domain. And that is the first step. But then, as you're saying, through the distribution process, and then when we think about the need to get excess vaccines from certain countries into others, into making sure that those vaccines are made available where they are needed, at all of those different steps, there are high risks of corruption, no doubt. And I think that we need to have the capacity to make sure that we are looking into the different steps of the not only the contracting, but also the distribution process, to make sure that we are mitigating all the risks involved. And at a national level, I must say, and it all goes back to data, even at a national level in rich countries, it is many times difficult, even for policymakers, for parliamentarians, to have access to the data they need to understand what is happening within the management of the pandemic. And so if that is the case for us, in basically where the rule of law is supposed to apply, and we are at the highest level of policy making, how can we expect the rest of the world to be better? And so, of course, that is one of the major challenges we face.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I've been fighting a 4-week battle for the data about vaccination rollout in my own constituency in Birmingham, because I know that the poorest communities have the worst testing uptake and the worst vaccination rollout, and I'm trying to get that data into the public domain. So it is absolutely an issue for all of us. Fadi and Pia, I don't know if you had any further reflections that were inspired by what you've heard that you wanted to chip in before I go back to our keynote speakers to wrap up.
Well, it's 11 p.m. here, so I was kind of counting on the founder of our Unite Parliamentary Network to cover all the questions that you had. But on that note, well, a lot of it is just really questions that go on the parliamentarians' mind, because we are responsible to answer to our constituents, right? So, like our former Senate president posted a question in the Q&A box, asking how is it that we were first informed that COVAX would be free, and then suddenly we were told it's not free and we have to pay a certain amount. So that goes into the trust level with government as well, because in as much as many of us support the government, then there's this question like, wait, when did that happen? How come we didn't know that there was a change like that? And then like in Southeast Asia, we know that there are like 4 or 5 countries that have already started the vaccines and we don't have any. And so it's like, why don't we have any? What have we not done? You know, so these questions add to the insecurity of the population, because if the members of parliament are going to debate about it and people hear it, then they lose their sense of confidence on that. And that also goes with medical issues, scientific-based issues. Like there will be a news report and on a particular vaccine from a particular country, and a member of parliament will say, well, why don't we have it? Why is government so slow to accredit it? And sometimes somebody like me who's not a doctor, but we don't have a doctor in the Senate, will try to explain, well, there are processes. But then, you know, people are agitated and anxious, and it doesn't help with people's sense of control when we don't know how things are evolving. And there was a question earlier about, will the variants of the vaccine, of the COVID, overtake the rollout of the vaccine? And I had a conversation with somebody who is very familiar with the Chinese vaccines, and they said they're already giving their, not their second dose, but their second round. Like 6-7 months later, they're already doing a second round. And wow, we haven't even had the first dose of the first round. So just obviously, the better answers we have for our constituent, the better for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what's emerging here is a conversation about global strategy, and building trust and trust regimes are obviously going to be a really important part of that. Fadi, just very, very quick, any sort of quick points you wanted to just chip in?
Yeah, I think we brought up the point of being proactive for future pandemics, and I think that's going to be a concern, having effective CDCs in the country. So, you know, when you have those CDCs all over the place, that's going to be very helpful when where you can build collaboration and try to understand what's happening and try to pre-plan ahead of time, instead of falling into the surprise element of having a pandemic or epidemic developing into a pandemic. So that should be a concern, because not too many countries, they're quite serious and proactive when it comes to having their own CDC and trying to have their own CDC network with other CDCs of the world. So at least everyone can be ready and willing to mobilize resources and forces. Another key concern, we spoke a lot about, you know, manufacturing and distribution. And I'm concerned because we've seen this happening now with Pfizer signing few countries with few specific countries in return for sharing information. So certain countries are getting the priority, and that's going to be unfair for the rest of the world having their equitable share. And I think the WHO voiced their concern about that specific point, and that's going to be a concern if we need to get most of the global population vaccinated ASAP.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, let me go back to Mohammed and Thomas just to take us up to the hour. We've only got a couple of minutes, but we'd love to just hear any one thing you would like parliamentarians to do in their own constituencies, and one thing you would like us to help ensure our governments do.
Just one thing to underscore how vital transparency is to earning trust at the global level, at the country level, in allocation of resources, in deployment of vaccines. Without that transparency, the trust environment will always, I think, will remain murky. And I think that's an important point to take away from this.
Super, nice and clear. Thomas.
No, thank you. I cannot disagree with Mohammed. This is, spot on. The only thing I would add, perhaps as another thing to keep in mind, is this pandemic has revealed so many gaps in a health supply chains around the world, including in advanced economies. Let's use this opportunity to develop diagnostic, the treatment, and ultimately the future responses to pandemics. I think this is something that we need to keep in mind as we focus on transparency and a fair distribution. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, folks, that takes us up to the hour. Thank you so much indeed for an extraordinary set of perspectives from around the world in the course of 90 minutes. It's always incredible what we manage to get on the table. Today's discussion has been incredibly useful for us in thinking ahead to our meetings that we want to put together for the IMF World Bank spring meetings in April. We've heard a lot here that I think we just need to reflect on that will help us structure those meetings. Please, anybody who can, please share thoughts in writing. We have a good digital platform, a good newsletter that goes to parliamentarians around the world. We've built that platform so that we can work together more effectively and more quickly at sharing ideas. Please let us know if you'd like to get involved in the working groups that Ricardo mentioned. But for now, thank you so much indeed for everything that you're doing. Thank you so much for a brilliant discussion today. Stay well and stay safe, and I hope it's not too long before I see you again, probably on screen. If not before, then certainly at the spring meetings in April. Thanks very much, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.